Hi, I'm the Goblin, and welcome to my grotto, where I paint and showcase tabletop miniatures. This is the final part to a 4-part series wherein I attempt to paint 20 miniatures culminating in my 222nd miniature on 2/22/2022, aka my attempt at the so-named Tuesday Challenge. So be sure to check out the previous parts if you've missed them. Also, remember, if you enjoy this content, leaving a like, subscribing, and or commenting really helps the channel out, and it makes my day seeing your support. Speaking of, you can also support and follow me on Ko-fi, the link to which will be in the description. But now, on with the show. When I initially started on this little project, I had 4 large orc models planned for the finale. These would have been an homage to the first minis I ever painted, as they were made by the same company. However, once I got started, I realized I wasn't super into the mini I was painting, so I put those down to pick back up another day. But what are the minis I got painted for you today? Well, after changing directions, I looked over and saw this burrowing horror from Reaper Miniatures. I wasn't quite sure how I wanted to paint it. In theory, it's based on a bullet, and they're typically metallic, but I wasn't feeling that direction. But while I was watching The Legend of Vox Machina recently, there was a scene in an episode featuring a similar looking creature with red skin and a white bony armor, and that's where I got my inspiration. I again made use of this mystery reddish-brown sample paint from Reaper, and I mixed up various different bone paints that I had for the carapace. I wouldn't say this ends up being the most crisp, perfect paint job I've done, but it doesn't have to be. Besides, this is supposed to be a horror, and if it ends up being a little messy and unsettling, then great. I decided to go with these putrid neon green eyes, and once everything was pretty much covered, I doused this mini in a red wash as opposed to a brown or black one. Specifically, I used Reikland Flesh Shade from Citadel. I used the red wash for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to give the impression that some of that reddish body underneath was peeking through the various little gaps, and that this was indeed bone and organic material. Two, I picture this creature maybe thriving in an area with rich red clay or sand in its soil, and that would naturally begin to dye the creature a certain color. And it would make the red skin a lot more viable as a means of camouflage. It would probably stick out if this thing lived deep in like gray, dark stone caverns. If this is a land shark of sorts that lives closer to the surface, it will need to adapt to those surroundings. And when it's young, I imagine it's probably more similar to a burrowing lizard or a snake, and it won't have as much of this thick chitinous armor. And so the red skin would be a great means of camouflage in said environment if it's ever sitting on the surface. And just as it ages and grows more of this armor, that red clay will begin to dye the bony plates over time. Now this next mini I had thought about bringing in earlier. It's also from Reaper Miniatures, but I'm not entirely sure what to call it now since they've gone through a few name changes at this point. When I got it, it was listed as Masumi Demon Hunter. I don't know about wearing this outfit whilst hunting demons, but I did watch Wheel of Time recently, and I would say that this does really fit in with some of the outfits you can find on that show. You know, say what you want about some of the other elements of that series, but I think the costume and set design was undeniably on point for that show. I picked the mini itself up whilst preparing for the Daimyo expansion from Bones 5. I figured it had a thematic parallel, and I didn't have a lot of minis representing that sort of culture in my collection up to that point. I settled on a bright, vibrant blue for the main outfit and a complementary green for the boot and gloves. Something that also seems very popular in the sort of cultures that this mini and my paint scheme draw influence from, mainly that of historic China, is gold filigree on weapons and these red cloth highlights, which I used on the little spear and wrapping around the handle of the blade. The trickiest part of this mini ended up being the face. I am admittedly not always excited to paint faces. It's very tricky for me. But with this mini, leaving that area to just washes would have left the figure looking incomplete since the face is so prominent. So, with a few very fine brushes, I carefully dotted the lips, eyebrows, and eyes. Cool thing about eyes is if you overdo it, you can always just scale it back with whatever skin tone you used. And that's exactly what I ended up doing. But once I had gotten everything on there, I realized, hey, this face is one of the best I've ever done. Now, arguably, once I put the washes on to this mini, I kind of covered up some of that detail. It still was pretty good looking, and the thing about faces, especially on these small minis, is they don't have to be one-to-one with a real person's face, because you're going to be seeing this more or less at a distance of 3 to 5 feet at any given time, and unless you have eagle eyes, super hawk vision, you're not going to really see any of the details in the face except for the big pops of color like the eyebrows, the lipstick, and maybe the dots of the eyes. So in the end, the mini still ends up looking great, and it is easily one of, if not my favorite, from the entire project. These next two minis I painted more or less in tandem. The first one I started on was the female Oney from Reaper Miniatures. Other than knowing that I wanted the skin to be purple or blue and the club to be red, I wasn't sure what direction I wanted to take this in. At one point I considered gold armor, and that seemed like the way to go, so I put this nutmeg brown over everything, and then I realized that actually looked pretty good on its own, so I washed that. But then I went, well, let me try out the gold armor, and I realized it didn't really work. Most of this mini seems to be adorned in leather, and that just looked a little funky. I looked up some samurai armor for inspiration, found some gold with red overlaid, and decided that's the direction I wanted to go. I also ended up making a lot of the leather green. This won't win any awards, but it's an alright mini, and if I ever wanted to revisit it again someday, it's just paint. I always could. I originally had a more complex mini planned here, but then I looked at my watch and looked at how much I had left to paint and how quickly I was running out of time, so I decided to sub in something a bit less time consuming. And that's where this Goblin Book Merchant from Wildspire Miniatures comes in. To me, though, they look more like a little explorer holding a field guide, so that's what I ended up painting them as. Like I said, there's not a ton going on with this figure, but not everything needs to be a grand affair. That said, I do think these Wildspire minis could be elevated with a little bit more detail. Perhaps I could just take some green stuff and make some little greeblies of my own, but ideally that would already come on the mini. Also, I have no idea what the scale for goblins is with their figures, because this one's head is huge. The two that I painted previously, the goblins in a trench coat, tiny by comparison. Their head is the size of one of this thing's ears. So either I'm going to have to assume those are children, which sure, or that this guy is just unusually large. I mean, maybe he's a half goblin. Maybe he's half goblin, half dwarf, or half elf, whatever. You know what? Actually, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Yeah, that's it now. He's a half goblin. He's a half goblin book merchant and explorer. You know what? He's perfect now. You know what? No complaints. And last, but certainly not least, there's this, the Armadillo from Reaper Miniatures. This mini didn't get swapped out. I picked this as the last mini to paint before I even picked the first mini to paint, and this was for a couple of reasons. One, it's a Armadillo. That's really cool. And two, Reaper is based out of Texas, where there's apparently a lot of armadillos running around, and this is a nice way to pay a little homage. Painting this was actually rather easy, but I had to get all the right colors. So I looked up a lot of images of armadillos, and the species that I found best matched this had a reddish pink skin with more pink features towards the nose and ears, brown to black eyes, and gray to yellowish white shells? I guess that's what they would be called. For those plated sections, I used some apple barrel elephant gray. Seemed fitting. And for the body, I used that mystery sample on the pinkish areas and some Citadel Gorthor brown on the rest of the body. Once it was detail time, the eyes got dots of brown and black, and I used some Upshapti bone from Citadel to do the claws and to dry brush onto the shell. That dry brushing mimicked about as best I could the gradient I saw on those armadillos. And once a brown wash, Agrax Earth Shade, had been dolloped over the whole thing, suddenly the mini just came to life. It gave this sort of golden glaze over the whole thing that in a way matched both the different armadillos I was going to use for reference. And so now this mini just is like the perfect culmination of armadillo and someone turning into an armadillo thing. I'm really glad this was my 222nd mini because I think it turned out excellently, and it has a sort of thematic thing to it, sort of importance. And yeah, I'm just very happy how this worked out. And with that, the challenge is done. For me, this has been many days of hectic painting and editing, and it's very satisfying to finally have everything completed. Thank you so much for watching to this point. It really means a lot. And if you enjoyed the content, please leave the video a like and subscribe to the channel. If you really want to support me further, you can go over to Ko-fi. You just follow. You don't have to donate, obviously, but if you do, that really helps me out in affording more of this hobby and just generally not going broke in life. So yes, thank you so much for watching. Have a good one, and let's go paint some more minis.